And welcome back to America Right Now. It is the new warfare of the 21st century. Fewer bombs and missiles, more cyber attacks, digital espionage, and foreign influence campaigns. The hacking of the Continental Pipeline has raised awareness about the risks of these attacks and has increased calls for a robust strategy to defend our nation against them. Earlier, we caught up with former Acting Secretary of Homeland Security and visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation, Chad Wolf. You know, I don't blame Biden for this necessarily. I think that's a little unfair. I think there are forces that are trying to take advantage of Biden's perceived weakness. But presidents from both parties have known that this was a serious issue, a serious threat for years. So I want to discuss what are we doing and what needs to be done to protect against these threats. And let's start with the threats themselves. What should we be most concerned with?
Sure, absolutely. Particularly what we saw here with Colonial Pipeline is a ransomware type of cyber event here. And ransomware events have been increasing both in scope and size over the last several years, 2,400 different types of events in 2020, as well as the amount of ransom being paid out by victims in 2020, over $300 million dollars associated with that. So we've known for some time over the last several years that these are increasing events. I think what's different now is I think the federal government has largely looked at this as a private sector issue, that private sector companies are being targeted by these cyber criminals and then held for ransom until they pay and unlock their systems. But I think what Colonial Pipeline, SolarWinds late last year and others are starting to teach us is that this isn't a private sector commercial problem alone. This has larger economic society implications as well as national security implications. So I think what you'll see, and you saw this with an executive order by the Biden administration over the last 24 hours, is you're going to see more of a role of the federal government trying to come up with some solutions here, trying to break down some barriers in information sharing and threat information sharing between the private sector and the federal government, and do a number of other things to help the private sector out. Because when these types of events hit, they first hit the private sector, which is where about 80% or 85% of our critical infrastructure is owned and operated by. So the federal government is certainly playing sort of is helping the private sector, a supporting role of, in a sense. And so we need to do more in that.
Now let's talk about the who, Mr. Secretary. Who is behind these hacker networks, and should we be looking at Russia and China as culprits here? Should we be considering these acts of terror or acts of war?
Well, it's a good question, and each different attack, depending on the actors involved, they do differ. So both we see and we've seen in the past both nation-state attacks, cyber attacks. But we also have a number of cyber criminals that operate out of some of these countries, such as China and Russia, North Korea, Iran, and others, that have a loose, if any, affiliation with that nation state in particular. So it does work both ways. We see it both nation state actors and just your normal cyber criminals that are seeking refuge within these nation states. So I think there's a lot more that we can do, certainly from that foreign policy and diplomatic perspective as well, making sure that those countries are cracking down on those types of cyber criminals that are operating out of their territory, using their network and infrastructure to do that.
Now, we want to offer some hope to our viewers. Certainly, there are a lot of these that we intercept that don't actually come to fruition. But what are some of the important solutions that we might not be hearing about that you think that the government either should be doing or is doing now that just haven't really, quite gotten into the public consciousness just yet? Because people do want to feel like we are actually being proactive here and doing something about this.
Sure, absolutely. And you're exactly right. These types of ransomware events and compromises, or I should say, potential compromises, happen thousands and thousands of times every day that you don't hear about it. Obviously, Colonial Pipeline is something different because it impacts, right, from a fuel perspective, long gas lines and others. And so people are taking notice about that. So there's a number of things that are being done and that can be done more. So information sharing, there's some silos here on sharing information between the private sector and the federal government. What the federal government is very good at is trying to understand who's behind these attacks. And they have that type of intelligence and threat information that the private sector doesn't have. So trying to break down some legal barriers that the private sector can share that information with, I think, is absolutely critical. Also making sure that we diversify the types of software within the federal government network. So if you go back to SolarWinds, obviously that was a compromise of a Microsoft software and had the potential to really, do some issues within the federal government. And so we need to make sure that we're not solely reliant on one type of software provider, and that we have a backup and that we have multiple vendors really participating here.
I want to switch topics with you, Mr. Secretary, to the crisis on the border. The National Sheriff's Association recently conducted a survey that showed that 50% of respondents said the border situation is increasing COVID-19 cases in the U.S., and 55% of respondents said the border situation is increasing the abuse of migrant women. What is the White House missing about all of this?
Well, I believe what they're missing is they're not sending, a strong enough message, and B, they're not implementing enough policies to address the surge and the crisis that we see on the border. Instead, what they are simply trying to do is process people faster. And so their idea of a crisis is simply folks waiting longer lines to come in, and we're not processing them quick enough. The actual crisis is the fact that we have over 178,000 illegal apprehensions in 1 month alone, that we have advertised, and we have put a series of policies in place that allow these individuals to come into the U.S. to begin with. So what the administration needs to do is start enforcing the rule of law on that border, instead of simply trying to treat this as a capacity issue and trying to build more tents and more facilities and more space at the end of the day. They need to stop the surge before it gets to our borders. And if it does get to our borders, they need to apply a consequence for the illegal behavior. Just like you and I, we don't speed 80 miles an hour down a residential street because there's speed limits and there's consequences to that.
Right.
We need to put in consequences to folks that choose to make the decision to come here illegally.
Secretary Chad Wolf, thank you for your insights.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for watching the Heritage Foundation's YouTube channel. With more than 500,000 members, we are the nation's largest conservative research and education institution. We believe the principles and ideas of the American founding are worth conserving and renewing. Please help us further our mission by subscribing to this channel and sharing our videos with your family and friends.